the Trilateral Commission was one of a number of international consortiums of politicians, middle of the road, say, establishment intellectuals and corporate honchos that get together to decide what they think the New World Order should look like. This one was founded in the mid-1970s.
But that's such a cynical description. What's their ostensible reason for existing?
They feel that the world should be organized around basically a trilateral consensus, and the trilateral idea that they're talking about is the U.S., Japan, representing hegemonic interests in Asia, and Germany, representing Europe. So the trilateral would be Germany representing Europe, Japan, U.S.
And Britain just gets left out.
Well, you know, junior partner, former empire, they go along with us. Not that they're not consulted, but that this was a new conception of global power sharing, that the U.S. role in the world was changing. It was sort of multilateral rather than unilateral, right? You know, international capitalist rather than, you know, jingoistic nationalist capitalist, Yankee rather than cowboy, let's say. You know, say if Bush is kind of a cowboy, these were the Yankees.
Right.
David Rockefeller type Eastern establishment versus, you know, the Wild West.
Greg, wasn't this economically based when you mentioned, weren't they those three nations had very good economies at the time that you're speaking, isn't that?
Well, they were they were beginning to dominate. But the point of the Trilateral Commission was not only about managing the world economy, it was about managing the world in general. And one of the things, Samuel Huntington, people should read if they really want to know the way the establishment thinks, he was one of the main thinkers for this. He writes still to this day and is still influential. He writes now about the clash of civilizations, how we got to take down, you know, the fundamentalist surge. But he was saying then that what we need more apathy. The problem is people are making too many demands on government. There was a book that he published with a couple of other people called The Crisis of Democracy, published by the Trilateral Commission in 1976, shortly after Carter's election. Very interesting reading, even to this day. It's that what we need is more apathy because people are making too many demands. People are just want too much of government. We have to lower expectations of what people can expect from government. It's interesting. It's kind of worked out that way, you know? Okay, the other thing is that we have to increase respect for the presidency as an institution. Executive power has to be re-legitimized. Remember, this is happening after Nixon, after Watergate, okay? Right after. So it's a post-Watergate reconstruction effort. How can power be reconstructed along new lines? And these were the ideas. So we have to have a more passive public. Oh, he also said that political parties is only one way of constituting a democracy. Maybe we should not have political parties. Maybe we'd have some sort of unity administration, you know, break down the walls between the executive and the legislative branch. I mean, it's pretty scary stuff. And now this is 25 years ago. The project hasn't been completed. But to think of Brzezinski, who basically was the major domo of these efforts, as being a liberal, I mean, he can only be conceived as a liberal when you compare him to Dick Cheney or George Bush. Really, he's a center-rightist who is a war criminal, for God's sake. He's a war criminal. He in fact, created a war in Afghanistan. And you know what he said? It's interesting. I have the quote, but not in front of me. He was questioned 4 years ago about this decision that they made in the 70s, you know, we're going to provoke the Soviets to go into Afghanistan and provoke a war there and, you know, sucker them in. And he said, weren't you worried about, you know, like being in bed with these Islamic fundamentalists? Don't you think this could be dangerous? And he says, well, I leave that to the judgment of history as what is more important, you know, basically taking down the Soviet Union or a handful of radical clerics. Interesting. Okay. Very interesting. That was only 4 years ago. Just of how friggin' wrong somebody can be. You know, and yet he's still very popular on the talk show circuit. Being wrong doesn't prevent you from being quoted.
Would your reading of history then, what kind of light would you cast Carter in, politically? I mean, everybody, you know, the layperson on the street holds him up as like, oh, you know, well, he was the exception. He was a real good man.
I think Carter was a person who was possibly had some good intentions, but was basically bought and paid for by the establishment. I met Carter in '76, right at the beginning, when he was being promoted by the Trilateral Commission and the corporate establishment as the next John Kennedy. It's amazing. Right before the New Hampshire primary, I think it was Time magazine publishes this cover story about Carter, and it's not a photograph of him, it's like a rendering, and they make him look just like Kennedy. It's really freaky. You know, he had no real popular base of support, but they put him up there. So there was a meeting that was held down near in Brattleboro at some big plantation type place in Brattleboro for the presidential candidates running in the primaries, and a few of them were there. Fred Harris, who was a liberal, iconoclastic Democrat running for president, he comes, he's in a car by himself, he shows up, he gives his speech. Carter comes. Now, he hasn't won a primary yet, right? He's an unknown, relatively unknown governor from Georgia. He showed up with 20 Secret Service agents. The guy was friggin' totally surrounded. It was as if he was already the Democratic nominee before the New Hampshire primary. Okay, you couldn't get close to him without having a body search. So, I mean, this tells you something. I mean, is it all spontaneous, or is there a little bit of preconceived, you know,
tail wagging the dog?
And for the establishment, it was like the Republicans, you know, didn't seem viable. Jerry Ford was kind of a joke. They needed a new pony to ride, and Carter seemed like a good prospect. He was invited into the Trilateral Commission. I mean, these Trilateral guys are more liberal. I mean, if you have to choose villains, you might choose them over the Bush team. I'm not sure they're especially happy about these plans to you know, to go to war with Iraq. I mean, the main reason that you're not hearing objections right now is not because people think it's a great idea. It's because there's an election coming up.